It all started on a crisp autumn morning when I decided that I needed a change. Something that would break the monotony of city life and give me a fresh perspective. For months, I had been scrolling through real estate listings, searching for a place that wasn't just a house, but a story waiting to be told. That's when I stumbled across a listing that seemed almost too good to be true. A mountain house, abandoned for years, perched high above the winding valleys, shrouded in mist and surrounded by dense forest. The photos were eerie yet captivating. Nature had started to reclaim it, with vines crawling along the cracked walls and broken windows that reflected the golden hues of the sun filtering through the trees. Despite the obvious neglect, there was something about it that drew me in, something that whispered secrets of a past life, adventures, and untold stories. I booked a trip immediately, planning to see the property in person. The drive up the mountain was more challenging than I anticipated. The narrow roads twisted and turned, with steep cliffs on one side and dense forest on the other. The further I climbed, the quieter everything became. It was as if the world below had been left behind, and I was entering a realm untouched by time. Birds called from the treetops, and the wind rustled through the leaves in a way that almost felt like it was guiding me forward. I could feel my excitement building with every mile, and a mix of curiosity and apprehension bubbled inside me. When I finally arrived, the house was even more impressive than the pictures had suggested. Its wooden exterior, weathered and gray, seemed fragile yet resilient against the elements. The front porch sagged slightly, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, but there was a charm in its decay. Windows, some cracked, some entirely missing, allowed glimpses of the interior that hinted at a space frozen in time. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and something ancient that I couldn't quite identify. My heart raced with anticipation. This wasn't just a house. It felt like a portal to another era, a place where I could start anew, away from the chaos of modern life. I wandered around the exterior, examining the structure carefully. The roof had patches where shingles were missing, and moss had claimed large sections, but overall, it seemed structurally sound. There was a small garden area that had long since been overtaken by wildflowers and weeds. A stone path, barely visible under the overgrowth, led to what must have been a side entrance. Every corner of the property told a story. A rusted swing set in the yard hinted at children who once played there. A broken fence suggested long-forgotten boundaries, and a weathered mailbox still clung to its post, though it hadn't received mail in years. The more I explored, the more I felt a strange connection to this place, as though it were calling out to me, urging me to become a part of its story. When I finally pushed open the front door, a cloud of dust greeted me. The smell of damp wood and old plaster filled the air. Light filtered through the broken windows, casting eerie patterns on the floors. I could see remnants of the house's former life scattered about. An old rocking chair, a faded rug, and shelves lined with thick layers of dust. Some walls still had faded wallpaper, peeling and curling at the edges. It was clear that no one had lived here for years. Yet the house had a warmth to it that I couldn't explain. I moved cautiously through the rooms, taking in the history embedded in every corner. It was as if the walls themselves held memories, waiting for someone to awaken them. I spent hours exploring, documenting everything with photos and notes. I imagined what it must have been like when the house was full of life, the laughter of children, the smell of home-cooked meals, the quiet evenings by the fireplace. Each room sparked my imagination, and I could already see the potential for renovation, for breathing life back into this forgotten mountain retreat. The living room, despite its cracked floors and broken windows, could become a cozy space for gatherings. The kitchen, though outdated, had solid foundations for modernization. Upstairs bedrooms could be transformed into tranquil retreats, each with a view of the sprawling mountains. I could almost hear the echoes of the past blending with the possibilities of the future. Before leaving, I sat on the porch for a long time, gazing out at the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a sense of anticipation. I realized that this abandoned mountain house wasn't just a project. It was an opportunity to reclaim something that had been forgotten, to honor its history while creating a new chapter. As I drove down the winding road back to civilization, I felt a mix of
We
excitement
can
and
make this place feel
determination.
like home
I
again,
knew that once I returned,
together.
this house would no longer be abandoned. It would become a place of stories, memories, and transformation. Little did I know, the adventure was about to take a turn I never expected. One that would challenge everything I thought I knew about this mountain sanctuary. After visiting the abandoned mountain
We
house,
can make this
I
place
couldn't
feel like
stop
home
thinking
again,
about it. The
together.
image of its weathered walls, the broken windows, and the wild, overgrown garden kept replaying in my mind. That night, I sat in my small apartment in the city, scrolling through renovation ideas and sketching rough plans. I knew that turning this forgotten property into a livable, inviting home wouldn't be easy, but the challenge excited me. I wanted the house to retain its rugged, mountain charm while being modern enough for comfort. I started by researching similar mountain homes online, looking at design blogs, and watching countless renovation videos. Each idea sparked a new possibility, and I felt my imagination expanding, envisioning spaces full of light, warmth, and life. The first step was making a detailed plan. I needed to know exactly what the house needed structurally. So I made a checklist: roof repairs, window replacements, flooring restoration, and a complete inspection of the plumbing and electrical systems. I also wanted to preserve some of the original features, like the wooden beams, the stone fireplace, and the old hardwood floors, which gave the house its unique character. I pictured the living room with a restored fireplace as the centerpiece, the walls painted in soft, earthy tones, and furniture that felt cozy yet stylish. I imagined sitting there on a winter evening, watching the snow fall outside while feeling the warmth of the fire inside. Next, I thought about the kitchen, which was outdated but had great bones. I envisioned open shelving, a large wooden dining table, and plenty of natural light streaming through the windows. I pictured myself cooking meals surrounded by the aroma of fresh pine from the forest outside and the faint smell of the aged wood from the interior. Each room had its own personality, and my goal was to make the renovation highlight that while creating a cohesive, inviting atmosphere throughout the house. I spent hours sketching floor plans and noting down what could be restored, what needed replacing, and what could be improved. Budgeting was another critical aspect. Renovating an abandoned mountain house was not going to be cheap, and I had to be realistic about costs. I made a spreadsheet with estimated expenses for materials, labor, permits, and unforeseen issues that might arise. I also factored in the cost of hauling debris down the steep mountain roads and transporting building materials up to the site. I realized quickly that working on a house in such a remote location would require careful planning, not only to save money, but to ensure safety and efficiency. I started researching local contractors and suppliers who were experienced with mountain properties and could handle the unique challenges of this terrain. I also considered the exterior of the house. The overgrown garden had potential, but would need a lot of work. I imagined clearing the weeds, planting native flowers and shrubs, and creating a small vegetable patch. The porch could be restored with fresh wood and comfortable seating, providing the perfect place to enjoy sunrise views over the mountains. I even thought about adding subtle lighting along the paths and the driveway to enhance safety without ruining the natural beauty of the surroundings. I wanted the house to feel like it belonged to the mountain, blending in with nature while offering modern comfort. As the days passed, my excitement grew, but so did my apprehension. Renovation was going to be physically and mentally demanding. I began considering the tools and equipment I would need, from power drills to paint sprayers, ladders, and safety gear. I made a list of essential tools to bring up the mountain and those I could rent locally. I also started imagining the time it would take, preparing myself for long days filled with hard work, sweat, and sometimes frustration. Despite this, I couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation. Every challenge felt like a step closer to bringing the house back to life. I also thought about the personal touches I wanted to add to make the house truly mine. I planned cozy reading nooks near windows, a rustic dining area with handmade wooden furniture, and shelves to display books and memorabilia I had collected over the years. I imagined the walls adorned with art and photographs that would tell stories of past adventures and new memories yet to be made. Each idea made me feel more connected to the house, as if it were already welcoming me home. I even considered small eco-friendly upgrades, like solar panels and a rainwater collection system, to make the house sustainable while preserving its natural surroundings. Finally, I reached out to a few friends who shared my enthusiasm for renovation projects. I wanted their advice, ideas, and maybe even some hands-on help. Discussing the project with them brought fresh perspectives and suggestions I hadn't considered. From interior design tweaks to structural solutions for some of the more challenging aspects of the house. Their encouragement boosted my confidence, making me believe that despite the obstacles, this dream was achievable. The house was no longer just an abandoned property. It was becoming a vision, a project full of potential and personal significance. By the end of that week, my plan was solidifying. I had a clear picture in my mind of how the house would look. A detailed budget, a list of required materials and tools, and a timeline for the renovation. I felt ready to take on the mountain, armed with preparation, excitement, and determination. The abandoned house that had once seemed lonely and forgotten now felt alive with possibilities. It was no longer just a structure. It was a canvas, and I was eager to paint its next chapter, knowing that every nail, every brushstroke, and every repaired beam would bring it closer to the dream I had envisioned. Little did I know, the journey ahead would be far more complicated than just renovations, and the mountain had a few surprises in store that I could never have anticipated. A few weeks after finalizing my renovation plans, I finally returned to the mountain house, eager to begin the work I had been envisioning for so long. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cool mountain breeze that makes your skin tingle and your mind feel alive. I parked my car near the bottom of the property and began carrying tools and supplies up the steep path, my excitement growing with every step. The house looked just as I had remembered, its weathered exterior waiting for the touch of transformation. I had barely set my first few boxes of tools down on the porch when I heard voices loud. Unmistakable human voices coming from inside the house. My heart skipped a beat. I had expected silence, maybe the occasional bird or rustling wind. But voices, that was impossible. The house was supposed to be abandoned. Cautiously, I approached the front door. As I got closer, I could make out fragments of conversation. It sounded like a family arguing. My first instinct was to call out, to announce myself, but then I hesitated. Something about the tone of their voices made me pause. There was frustration, defensiveness, and an unmistakable sense of entitlement. I peeked through a cracked window and froze. Inside, the living room, my future renovation centerpiece, was occupied by a family. A woman in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and assertive, was gesturing wildly as she spoke. Beside her were two younger adults, perhaps her children, who seemed both annoyed and wary of my presence. They looked at me as if I had just walked into their home, their eyes narrowing with suspicion and disbelief. I stepped back, my mind racing. How could this be? The house had been listed as abandoned for years. No one had lived here. No one had maintained it. And yet, here they were, acting as if they belonged. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. My instinct was to retreat and call the authorities. But part of me wanted to understand the story behind this unexpected occupation. I decided to knock gently on the door, hoping for a civil conversation. The moment the knocks echoed through the empty spaces, the woman's head snapped toward the sound. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on me immediately. She approached the door slowly, clearly trying to assess whether I was a threat. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice firm and unyielding. I introduced myself, explaining that I had purchased the property legally and that I was planning to renovate it. She laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound that made my stomach tighten. "Purchased it? You mean this house you just drove up to? This is our home," she snapped. My heart sank. I had anticipated complications like broken pipes or structural damage, but I hadn't imagined a confrontation like this. The realization hit me that I was dealing with people who had likely been living here illegally, and they had no intention of leaving. Their sense of ownership was clear, and they were ready to defend it. The tension in the air was palpable. I tried to explain calmly that the house had been on the market for years and that the sale had been finalized legally through a licensed realtor. I showed them the documents on my phone, hoping to convince them that I was in the right. But the woman, who I later learned was named Karen, waved me off dismissively. Legal papers don't mean anything if we reliving here, she said. Her children echoed her sentiments, arguing that they had been surviving in the house while no one else cared about it, and that forcing them out would be cruel. My frustration grew as I realized this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. This was a standoff, and I had no idea how to resolve it without escalating into something dangerous. I decided to step inside cautiously, keeping my hands visible to avoid any misunderstanding. The house, once a symbol of my dreams, now felt like a battlefield. Every corner I had imagined decorating, every wall I had envisioned painting, was now occupied by strangers who refused to acknowledge my ownership. I looked around and noticed how they had made themselves comfortable old mattresses on the floor, a small makeshift kitchen in the corner, personal belongings scattered about. It was clear they had been living here for months, maybe even years. The house, though abandoned on paper, had become their refuge. I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and empathy. Negotiations began, fraught with tension. I offered to help them find alternative accommodation or compensate them for leaving temporarily while renovations began. Karen, however, was stubborn and defiant. She argued that they had nowhere else to go and that the house belonged to them in a moral sense, regardless of legal documents. Her attitude was infuriating but also cunning. She was exploiting my patience and trying to assert dominance. Hours passed as we talked, each side refusing to fully concede. I realized that this encounter was not just about a house, it was about control, pride, and survival. Karen's family had created a narrative that gave them power, and breaking through that without confrontation required careful strategy. By the end of the day, we had reached a tentative understanding. I could stay, but I would need to respect their space temporarily. It wasn't ideal, and I had hoped to begin renovations immediately. But at least I wasn't being forced out completely. As I left that evening, carrying my tools back down the mountain, I reflected on the encounter. I had imagined a quiet, solitary renovation project, but reality had delivered a far more complex challenge. Karen and her family weren't just obstacles, they were players in a story I had unknowingly stepped into. I realized that reclaiming this house would require patience, cleverness, and perhaps a few unexpected maneuvers to outsmart them without causing harm. The mountain, once a serene escape, had now become the stage for a battle I hadn't anticipated. And the next steps I took would determine whether my dream of restoring the house could ever become a reality. The following days at the mountain house were a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Every morning, I drove up the winding road, unsure of what I might encounter. Karen and her family seemed determined to assert their presence, moving around the house as if they were preparing for a confrontation at any moment. Their stubbornness made even the simplest tasks, like inspecting the interior or planning renovations, feel like navigating a minefield. I had to be careful with every step I took, every tool I carried, and every word I spoke. The tension was palpable, like an invisible force pressing against me. And I realized that resolving this situation would require far more than patience. It would require strategy. One afternoon, I decided to explore the basement, a space I had barely glimpsed during my first visit. I thought it might offer some insight into the structural integrity of the house and perhaps a quiet place to plan the renovation without immediate confrontation. As I descended the creaking stairs, the smell of damp wood and earth filled my senses. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window near the ceiling. That's when I noticed something strange: old boxes stacked in the corner, partially hidden under a dusty tarp. Curiosity overpowered caution, and I began to sift through them. Inside were letters, photographs, and journals dating back years. The contents revealed personal stories and secrets about the previous occupants and, surprisingly, about Karen's family. Evidence suggested that they had been coming to this house for generations, long before it was officially abandoned. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, their presence didn't feel entirely illegitimate. They had a connection to this place, one that ran deeper than legal documentation. I realized that their stubbornness and defiance weren't just selfishness, they were rooted in history, in memories, in a sense of belonging that I hadn't considered. The letters spoke of family events, celebrations, and hardships endured within these walls. They painted a picture of a family intertwined with the house, a lineage that claimed it in a way my paperwork never could. I felt conflicted. On one hand, I had purchased the property legally and had every right to renovate it. On the other hand, these hidden stories made me see the house in a completely new light, as a home rather than just an abandoned structure waiting for restoration. When I emerged from the basement, Karen was waiting. She had been watching from the porch, her eyes narrowing as I carried my tools past her. The tension escalated immediately. "What are you doing down there?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusing. I considered lying, but something about the raw honesty in her eyes made me pause. Instead, I explained that I was assessing the property, trying to understand what needed to be done before renovations could begin. She crossed her arms, clearly skeptical, but didn't press further. I realized that she was carefully testing me, trying to gauge whether I would push back or back down. Every interaction felt like a chess match, and I had to think several moves ahead. Over the next few days, small confrontations became routine. Karen's family challenged every decision I made about the house. They questioned my plans for the kitchen, the placement of furniture, even the color of paint I intended to use. Their knowledge of the house was extensive, and they weren't afraid to assert it. One evening, as I was measuring the walls in the living room, Karen approached with a stack of old photographs. She held them up, showing me images of her family in this very room decades ago. The sight was disarming. Seeing their lives captured within these walls made it clear that I wasn't simply dealing with squatters, I was dealing with people whose identity and history were intertwined with this home. I had to adjust my approach. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about empathy, negotiation, and understanding. As I navigated these tense interactions, I began to notice other secrets hidden throughout the house. Behind loose panels in the attic, I discovered journals that hinted at financial troubles, disputes over inheritance, and even long-forgotten conflicts with neighbors. These documents revealed why the house had been abandoned in the first place and why Karen's family had chosen to return. Their actions, once frustrating, now made sense in context. They weren't malicious. They were defending a legacy, a piece of their family's history that had been left in limbo. The more I uncovered, the more complex the situation became. Every room seemed to hold a new revelation, every hidden corner a story I hadn't anticipated. Despite the tension, there were moments of connection. Occasionally, Karen would share anecdotes from the house's past, funny incidents, heartwarming memories, even moments of sorrow. These glimpses into their lives reminded me that beneath the confrontation was a shared love for the mountain home. Slowly, a fragile truce began to form. I learned to negotiate small victories without dismissing their feelings. I would repair one window or clear one room while respecting their occupied spaces. We began to communicate, albeit cautiously, learning each other's boundaries and tolerances. What had begun as outright conflict gradually evolved into a delicate balance of power, respect, and negotiation. Yet, the hidden secrets of the house were far from fully revealed. Each discovery deepened my understanding of Karen's family and the history they carried with them. I realized that renovating this house wasn't just a matter of physical labor. It was about navigating a web of emotions, memories, and relationships that span generations. Every confrontation became a lesson in patience, every argument an opportunity to understand motivations, and every small agreement a step toward a resolution that would honor both the past and my vision for the future. The mountain house, once a simple dream, had transformed into a living narrative, full of tension, secrets, and the promise of eventual reconciliation. The final resolution didn't come with shouting or dramatic ultimatums, but with a quiet inevitability that Karen and her family could no longer escape. After uncovering the documents and gathering undeniable evidence of illegal occupancy, I contacted a local attorney who specialized in property disputes, especially in rural and mountain areas. Within days, the situation shifted from emotional arguments to legal reality. Official notices were issued, and timelines were clearly defined. Karen's confidence began to crumble the moment authority entered the picture. Her arguments, once loud and aggressive, became fragmented and defensive, as though she finally understood that this was a battle she could not win. When I informed Karen that law enforcement would be involved if the house wasn't vacated by the deadline, her reaction was nothing like before. There was no yelling, no threats, just a long, heavy silence. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked tired. Her family members avoided eye contact, quietly packing their belongings while pretending not to notice me. The house, which had felt tense and hostile for weeks, grew strangely calm, as if it knew a chapter was closing. On the final morning, I arrived early, expecting another confrontation. Instead, I found the porch empty. Karen and her family were inside, loading the last of their belongings into an old truck parked near the tree line. Karen barely looked at me as she passed. Her shoulders slumped, her voice low as she muttered something about unfair systems and being pushed out. I didn't respond. At that moment, I realized that engaging emotionally would only reopen wounds. Sometimes, the strongest response is silence. When the truck disappeared down the mountain road, I stood alone in the driveway, listening to the sound fade into the forest. The stillness that followed felt unreal. No footsteps overhead, no whispered arguments behind walls, no sense of being watched. For the first time since buying the property, the mountain house was truly mine. The weight I had been carrying lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of relief and accomplishment. Inside, the house bore the scars of conflict, scuffed floors, patched walls, makeshift alterations, but it also felt lighter. I opened every window, letting fresh mountain air sweep through the rooms, pushing out the heaviness that had settled there. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust particles floating like remnants of the past finally being released. I walked from room to room slowly, not as an intruder or negotiator, but as the rightful owner envisioning a future again. Renovations resumed shortly after, this time without resistance or interruption. Contractors came and went. Tools echoed instead of arguments, and progress was visible every single day. The house responded almost eagerly to the changes. Rotten boards were replaced, broken windows restored, and the structure itself seemed to stand a little taller with each improvement. What once felt like contested territory became a project of healing, both physically and emotionally. Yet, I didn't erase the house's history entirely. Some of the old photographs and items I had found were carefully boxed and stored. They were reminders not of entitlement or conflict, but of the lessons learned. The mountain house had taught me about boundaries, patience, and the dangers of assuming appearances tell the full story. I had walked into this situation expecting a simple renovation and walked out stronger, wiser, and far more grounded. Months later, when the renovations were complete, the house was transformed. Warm wooden interiors, a restored fireplace, open views of the mountains. It had become everything I once imagined and more. Friends who visited were amazed, often commenting on how peaceful the place felt. They had no idea of the battles fought within those walls, the secrets uncovered, or the tension that once filled the air. And that was exactly how I wanted it. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, I reflected on the journey. Buying an abandoned house had seemed like a risk, but reclaiming it had been a test of character. I had learned that ownership isn't just about paperwork, it's about responsibility, resolve, and knowing when to stand firm. Karen's family had tried to claim the house through emotion and manipulation, but truth and persistence had prevailed. Occasionally, I still think about them and hope they found stability elsewhere, but I don't regret standing my ground. The mountain house deserved a future, not endless stagnation rooted in deception. By confronting the situation head-on, I gave it that future. Now, when the wind moves through the trees and the house creaks softly at night, it no longer feels ominous. It feels alive. The echoes of conflict have been replaced by peace, purpose, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most rewarding destinations. What began as an abandoned structure on a mountain became a home and a reminder that even the most difficult battles can end with clarity, growth, and renewal.